Okay, good afternoon, HPAC members. Thank you all for being here at the third meeting of the Housing Production Advisory Council. The meeting is called to order with nearly all of our members present. I will pass it over to co-chairs Hall and Tuvey to begin the meeting. And it looks like co-chair Tuvey is still connecting to audio, so we will. All right.
All right. Thank you, Matt. JD, you want to kick us off? Looks like you're on the audio now. We got you.
Sure. Sorry, I'm here. I missed it. I missed my invite somewhere. Sorry about that, everybody. Good to see everybody. So welcome, everybody. This is meeting 3 for the Housing Production Advisory Council. It's good to see everybody and keep up the good work. We got a lot more to go. So we'll kick this off today. Today's meetings, we'll obviously go through the agenda. Some of the objectives we want to do today is making sure that all the members have received the survey results. We'll be going through some of that, the full detail, as well as some of the annotated recommendations. So the staff will present on the summary with the guiding questions from our discussion after the break. By the end of today's meeting, we need to have all the topics identified. That's existing recommendations as well as new issues and barriers that we've been working on until last week. We'll also need to have recommended work groups for the governor and co-chairs consideration co-chairs consideration. The co-chairs will work with the governor to identify work group chairs. So that's something Damien, Matt, and I will be working on to get a few people, depending on how many work groups we have. Each one of them will also have a chair that will be kind of leading that work plan. We also need to have a recommended, we need to have all of our topics assigned to the work groups. So all the information we've had, all the recommendations from the staff, as well as new ones coming from all of you, need to make sure assigned so we're not leaving any of those issues on the table. And then we also need to have a high-level guidance for work groups on how to prioritize topics. We all know there's going to be time limitations. We want to really have kind of an understanding of how to dial in our workflow, how to bring that information back to the group, as well as elevating it all the way up to the governor's office, and then how to prioritize that. So if there's any questions about today's kind of tasks, we'll go ahead and open the floor up for any questions real quick, and about today's work group. And if not, then we can roll right into our first topic with the survey results with Elise and Matt. Any questions for today? I'm sorry if I'm a little frantic. I came running into my office and getting signed on real quick. Good to go? Okay, great.
Yes.
We'll jump over to Elise.
It looks like Councilmember Madsen has a question.
Yep.
Great.
Go ahead.
Thank you, co-chair. I guess my question's a process question that I'm eager to get to the prioritization of recommended strategies. I'm also anxious about the ability from here forward to really engage with broader network beyond our HPAC in those recommendations, particularly industry, affordable housing industry professionals from my lens is one that I hope to bring into this process. So do we see that opportunity before us here in the next few months? And I guess just the global question of how are we best situated to be able to pull that into our work here as the HPAC?
All right. I'd be glad to take a first crack at answering that, if you don't mind. Thank you, Joel, for the question. So as folks know, just process-wise, we're on a pretty short timeline to issue the framework, but then we have an opportunity to, once we establish that high-level framework, delve down into the details, and that's anticipated to happen through the working groups, which we'll be talking about later today. And those working groups will have a smaller set of people in them than what we're talking about today, but we're also able to access expertise that's not on the HPAC, whether that's from different industries or from the departments within the state as well. So the working groups will be able to, as needed, get the information and utilize the connections of the state as well as the folks on the group to get the information needed to assess these different recommendations and really kind of implement the high level prioritization scheme that we're talking about today. So that's the thinking. There's going to be a lot of component parts of that in discussion, and that's going to happen in different rooms in different ways. But that is the general thinking.
Thank you.
I would add to that.
Yeah.
And I would add to that, as soon as the press release came out with the names, I'm sure, I don't know if this happened to everybody else, but I got half a dozen emails, and it's like, I got something to say too. And so I have been building kind of my own little group. It's from Eastern Oregon, people that reached out to me. That I'm kind of just sending a digest for, I haven't done it yet, but I'm kind of like building that list now. And had just met with a few people. We've had a request for people to meet with us to kind of show what they're doing in housing. I just had one yesterday. And so I don't think there's anything that would discourage anybody from doing that and bringing in that additional work. Certainly reach out to your constituents and people that you have in your networks to get, for feedback. That is something we've discussed, is like how and when do we actually get some public input into this, potentially at the end of this meeting or at the end of this month, and we get starting in April, get some feedback, some general feedback about it. But then so how do we roll that back? How do we kind of pull that back in? Because we do have a short timeline. We need to keep moving forward. But I do think it's going to be important to have some check-ins with the public and a larger constituency. Any other questions? Nobody? Okay, we'll roll over to Elise.
Hey folks, good afternoon. My name is Elise Cordell-Kennedy, and I work for Oregon Housing and Community Services as the Senior Research Analyst. It is really lovely to be here with all of you today. I had the pleasure of sitting and listening to the previous two meetings, and now I'm here with all of you today. So thanks so much for having me. The reason I'm here today is to very briefly, not take up too much time, chatting about the survey results. So OHCS administered the survey on behalf of the governor's office. And so I just kind of wanted to talk through that really quickly. You should have all received a survey document that was put together by us at OHCS and a variety of folks that really gave the raw, sort of unfiltered recommendations that we prioritized simply based on the number of selections that they received. So you should all have that. And then I believe yesterday evening, there was a summary document that was set out, which was to categorize and put together a lot of the recommendations. There were many. So we endeavored to make a smaller, more categorized document for you to have. So those will support you today as we talk through the survey, and then certainly moving forward in your work groups. So the objective of this survey, as I think you all know, because there were 21 respondents who took it, so most of you took it, was to let staff to let everyone know what the existing recommendations within each, I've been calling them policy areas, that you as members of the HPAC want to continue to develop and to continue to mull over and sit with throughout the course of the HPAC towards some final recommendations. As I mentioned, there were 21 respondents to the survey, and there were over 60 recommendations that were originally in the survey. And all of those, excuse me, all of those 60 recommendations were selected by at least someone, usually a couple of people. And again, you can refer to your large summative, I believe, 27-page document to see which recommendations those were and which ones received the largest number of selections. So there were 60 of those recommendations. And then there were, I think, perhaps 120 or 130 new additional recommendations that each of you took the thought and time and care to submit for review. So really appreciate the effort that went into everyone's time here to share those with the broader group. So in addition to the 60 recommendations that were originally on the survey, you'll see all those 100 or so additional recommendations. So again, just kind of, the 6 policy areas that that the survey originally asked folks to sort of think of recommendations under is affirmatively furthering fair housing, affordable and market rate, affordable housing development, building codes and inspections, labor supply and workforce, and land use and zoning. So I don't think it is the intention of today's meeting to spend time talking about each of these recommendations or any of these recommendations, but more to really understand sort of the process through which these recommendations were procured and organized. The second document that I believe you all received last night was sort of the brainchild of many staff members who are, part of agency staff, work together to take all of these recommendations and sort of categorize them with some sub-themes, and then bring some of them together, really looking through the lens of what is a barrier and what is a solution to sort of help move folks into thinking in a generative way about identifying barriers, and then why we're all here to identify some solutions. So I think for the rest of the day, we want to spend time helping folks understand or generate some ideas around what the work group structure itself should be, whether it should stay these 6 priority areas, or there were a number of folks who identified new areas for work groups to be broken into, and that's later on in the slide. I don't think that's me to sort of walk folks through that, but there were certainly some really great ideas that folks had for how we want work groups to be sort of categorized, and what policy areas or areas within development those should be grouped as. And then I think the next part is while we don't want to focus today so much on the actual recommendations, but we do want to get folks to think about the mechanism to prioritize the recommendations, how folks want to do that once we get to the prioritization phase. So I think that's all from me, unless anybody has any more specific questions about the survey that I can answer, but I'm certainly happy to talk through anything else, but I will pass it now, I think, back to Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Elise. So again, just kind of following up with Elise's comments to give a bit more detail and lay out some questions for the co-chairs to facilitate. Within the 6 categories, and again, these were the staff grouping categories, you as council members identified all 56 recommendations. So you wanted to revisit all recommendations within the work group process. So that's kind of one key thing. And so for the conversation that'll be facilitated by the co-chairs after this quick presentation, it will really be, does the HPAC want to include all 56 recommendations? And then given that large number, or if all 56 are included, or if there is a reduction in the number of topics, how should then the work groups themselves prioritize between the list, between all the topics that are on the list? In the condensed document of the survey results, so we took the full detailed survey results, we condensed it down, we tried to summarize where there was a lot of overlap or duplication in the identification of barriers or the identification of recommended solutions, recommended proposals to increase housing production. We grouped them into the same categories. These are not necessarily the categories that you'll need to use as a part of your framework document. Part of the conversation this afternoon will be whether or not to rework them. But you can see that once we condense them down, around 10-ish topics per item, with the exception of land use and zoning, which neared 20 topics. So we've provided some guiding questions, again, just to be thinking about, are there any topics missing for the new issues or barriers? Are they grouped correctly, or are they the right groups? And then again, how should HPAC give guidance to work groups on how to prioritize between the topics? Something else that came up in the survey, which was great, that we wanted to just lay out again for the discussion today, is feedbacks on the work groups themselves, which we had several council members that laid out that they didn't think that the categories, if the categories were going to translate directly into the work groups, that they didn't think the categories were the right categories to be thinking about. So, I'm not going to really contextualize this. We tried to take this directly from the survey results. There was these are the existing category structures that we've been grouping things into. So an alternative potential one that we received from a council member was that affirmatively furthering fair housing should be removed as a category and integrated into the 5 remaining categories. An alternative 2 is to structure the categories in a way that more closely match the process by which housing development occurs. So first looking at the availability of land, then the entitlement process, then codes and design, workforce, and then ownership and financing. A third is very similar, just I think slightly different categories and it's slightly different order, but again, focusing on areas of development through the development process. And then a fourth didn't have a lot of context, but there was an alternative proposed that these might be the best 4 categories to work with for grouping all of the topics. And then for developing the work groups and assigning the different topics to the work groups. So, one thing that I do want to share with the council is I just want to, again, reiterate Elise's point, which is there's a lot of recommendations. There's a lot of existing recommendation that HPAC members highlighted as important to revisit during the work group process. There were a lot of new issues that people identified as barriers to housing production or proposed solutions to housing production. And again, we tried to consolidate them down. We tried to make it more digestible, looking toward the plan framework, looking to the work groups. We may have missed one. So if you find that something that you wrote down is not in there, just connect with me. It wasn't an attempt to exclude any barrier or exclude any new proposed item, but rather just to help give you a more manageable document to work with. And then I think just the last thing I'll mention, and then Elise and I are available for questions about the survey, the process overall. I think we're quite a bit ahead of schedule, which is great because that leaves more time for HPAC discussion. Is to the extent possible, I think ideally at today's meeting is not to get into the detail of the recommendations, but focus on, hey, we need to group these topics. We need to group these recommendations and new topics. We need to figure out how we want to propose structuring work groups to the governor. We need to figure out how we want to prioritize given the volume. And once we get into the work groups, we need to give some guidance to the work groups on how to prioritize those. And if there is anything that is missing, if there's anything that's mischaracterized, I'll just say, email me and we'll facilitate changing that between now and the next meeting when it does come back. So don't fixate as much on the wording that's in the condensed document as in, did my thing get in there or not? We can address that on the back end. And I think today's meeting is more about process and just managing the HPAC process to be able to finish the framework and roll into the work group. So I think with that, that's all we wanted to share. Happy to take any questions from members or the co-chairs, but beyond that, we just wanted to leave as much time as possible in this meeting for council discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Elise. I see a couple hands going up. Before we get into, we'll totally get to the questions, but want to use the time before our break here. We've got until 2:20 to kind of address a couple of those question prompts, I think, to the extent that we can. One being, now that we've all seen the compiled survey results, is there anything else that we would like added? And then and then address generally structurally whether or not to include all 56 or however many recommendations we end up with. On that, Matthew, when you say include all 56, that means in the framework, and then we'll be able to work things after that as far as actually applying in the work group's prioritization versus is there anything that we clearly want to at this meeting or the next meeting of the HPAC leave out of the framework? That's the decision, I believe.
Yeah, thank you, Co-Chair Hall. Yes, so it is that the group did we had at least one council member identify every one of the existing recommendations as something that should be discussed in work groups.
Yeah.
And that's in addition to all of the new topics that the council members raised. So it's really, it is to understand if the council truly does want to carry over all 56 existing recommendations in addition to the new topics.
Okay. All right. So I want to go around to the group and the folks who have their hands up, but to the extent you can, if we focus on things that were not in the survey response that could be included, or your thoughts on how to proceed given that we have a number of recommendations. Do we want them all in the framework and then sort those in the work group setting, or do we want to take a first pass at trying to sort those? I want to acknowledge on that one that the way that this issue has been framed and the objective of so many more new housing units, it often makes it the answer to these questions is, yeah, we should do all of those things, but we need to be realistic on what we can tackle here as a group. So I see 3 hands up. I'm not sure which order they're going to go in, but they came up in. But Daniel, Bud, would you start?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think they're all worthy of getting referred to committee. The ones that were produced by staff are the result of some pretty extensive work. And so even if nobody had voted for them, I think we should at least take some time to digest and consider them. As far as process, I think we have to let the subcommittees do the prioritization. So I'm fine however we want to break it into committees. I'm happy to dump work on the chairs of the main group to divvy out those assignments. But once we get into subcommittees, the process I like, we use it, charrettes and public meetings, the cafe process, everybody gets the little dots and things are written up on the wall and you put your dots for the things that you like. If you got 4 dots, you can put them all on a topic or you can spread them out and use that as a way of prioritizing what to work through, because I don't think we're going to get to everything. But at the same time, I think we got to start working on our high priority stuff, but then there may be a lull for a month while we're waiting for data. And if you give the committees flexibility to prioritize and then just start working through them sequentially, given our time constraints, I think that's how we get the most bang for our buck.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And, while we haven't set dates or anything, that's what we're thinking as far as the best use of the month of April is really more in the work groups. Then meeting again as all the combined group and then figuring out each work group, figuring out what its work product's going to look like and the timeline for that, and hopefully sequencing some of that so we can get recommendations more on a rolling basis than all of them, like right at the end of the year. And
yeah, that was the other thing I was going to say is having some interim targets for the committees to say maybe we pass things from committee to the whole group in batches so that we can start digesting things that's hopefully the low-hanging fruit as a big group, so we don't just dump it all on the Thanksgiving meeting to hash out all the state's problems.
Fair enough. All right, thank you. Tom, Cody.
Damon, I'll add on to that. That was part of the discussion that came up, I think, during our Damien, me, and Matt's conversation the last couple of days, was that even like products from the HPAC could come out in stages as well, not just from the work groups. And so potentially, if we have information ready to go out for public and for action, even in July, I think we should probably be able to at least recommend that to the governor, that this is something that is ready to go now as a recommendation from the board, rather than waiting for everything to come out in November. So that's something we can even coordinate through all the way up to the entire HPAC.
Thank
you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Something I kind of had this epiphany after the last meeting, and it may be meaningless, but that we shouldn't be looking at this, or one way to potentially approach this is to not look at this as creating new policy exercise or create new policy exercise, but rather as a reductive exercise. So to really be analyzing and addressing the existing impediments to supply, even if we do it only temporarily, because our charge is to dramatically increase supply. And that made me think about, and Ernesto, I think in our last meeting had that comment, but that made me think about maybe the work groups, rather than organizing work groups around policy, I would offer, and again, I'm just one voice, so I admit that this may be not a good idea, but to organize in, rather than policy groups, groups such as removing barriers, group 1, incentivizing production, group 2, group 3, amplifying access, group 4, growing our workforce, so that, the removing barriers group, by way of example, could address numerous policy areas, but in categorically, function to that end. Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Jamie, can I ask a question to that? I love the idea. I'm just wondering if there would be enough people with subject matter expertise on each group to be able to go through each of the recommendations to identify barriers to be reduced. Or is it better to have the experts in assigned work groups and then identify barriers within that from their subject matter expert? So I guess it's the same side of the coin. I'm thinking that maybe that is a task for each of the groups, if it is a policy level type thing, that they need to identify those barriers per their area expertise areas. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think if we go that route, I do think having some overarching goals that we agree to, like those 4, though, would be helpful as kind of guiding principles for us as we move forward with this work. I think coalescing, galvanizing ourselves around these key things would be helpful.
Right.
Absolutely, and that one of the topics that we've been thinking about, other than just sort of the logistics of how many work groups and how many people and how many members are on, how many work groups is each member on, et cetera, is how do we kind of bridge across them, because all these things are interrelated. One of the things that came up fairly consistently in our prior meetings and some of the survey results is about coordination of efforts, both within the different departments of the state government, but as also between state and local governments and between industry and different governments and all those different things. So how do we get everybody kind of moving in the same direction and make recommendations on that? So I think there's some, we've got at least some initial ideas about kind of keeping the, having some of the recommendations, the reporting of recommendations be somewhat uniform so that we can make comparisons, and then everybody hopefully providing a similar frame or applying a similar framework on the prioritization side. And then thinking about if there are later in the year opportunities to prop up working groups to look at once we have an initial set of proposed recommendations, how do we coordinate those and how do we talk about implementation so that everything works out, or we have a recommendation on how to do things as well as kind of what to do, just because some of these problems are easily straddle however we're going to categorize these topics. Let's see who got a couple more hands up. Justin Wood, go ahead.
Hey there. So just a couple of things, and I'm echoing a little bit what Tom said and what I've heard some other people say, is that I'm more of a fan of looking at these more from a topic perspective and trying to figure out the whether, I know it's like alternative 2 and alternative 3 kind of broke some of these things out into more overarching topics and trying to put our subject matter kind of expertise from different people into those topics. In part from selfishly, I'd like to see us go into work groups where we kind of collaborate our knowledge and work on these things from different perspectives. But I you know, my passion and one of the things I really want to focus on this is kind of the permitting regulatory side of things and the delays to that we're seeing on the land use it's actually more the building permit side of things. And I know that's something that not just people building, you know, market rate housing are dealing with. That's also stuff that the nonprofits are dealing with and the subsidized first. And so I'd hate for, you know, me to go into one room and the people in the nonprofits to go into another room, and we're focusing on the same issue and we're not sharing the same ideas. And so it seems like it's more important to me that the people who have that passion for trying to overhaul the regulatory permitting side of things, regardless of what their background comes from, should be the people working on that topic. If we can figure out we've got enough people to focus on those topics. And the only other little thing that I wanted to just say, kind of more for clarification as we're going through these, is in the survey, and I don't know if this was done intentionally or not, there's a lot of referrals to building code. When I look at that and when I look at the survey, I'm more looking at just cities' codes as it relates to development, like their planning codes, all the other codes. I don't personally think the state building code is primarily a big issue. Now, not to say that we can't have some conversations about it, but when we reference building code, I don't think that that's what a lot of us are thinking about when we're talking about just development codes in general. So I just clarification and somebody might correct me on that. I saw a couple of head nods, but I just kind of want to keep that in mind as we're talking about codes in general.
Thank you, Justin. And yeah, I think that's a good point because everyone's not as involved in the kind of front end entitlement side of development, but you know, there are different codes, and depending on what type of structure you're building, you may or may not have different barriers based on the zoning code versus the structural code. And especially once you get into kind of more trying to fund vertical construction, and the ways that you can do it on the building code become very impactful to your bottom line. And I know that some folks have spoken strongly about modular and the opportunities for that. And sometimes that clashes with standard building code as well. So, different topics, good to call out.
I would, if I could, Damien, too, I would add that briefly about the coordination between the work groups. I think, having joint meetings, I think would be encouraged. Obviously, it's another meeting, so probably be judicious in those. But one of the things we did discuss potentially is each of the chairs on each of the sub work groups would also probably meet either weekly or more frequently to like exchange those ideas as more of a collaborating group. So there'd be a little bit of an added kind of work assignment for those chairs. So that we can start seeing where those connection points are. So either they can take them back to their subject areas or coordinate some kind of group meeting. So there will be opportunities for that. Besides the HPAC that happens each month as well.
All right, JD. Yeah, we've got, as you can tell, we've got a lot of decision making between where we are now and what exactly is the process going to be. So Robert Justice.
Good afternoon. Thank you, co-chairs. I think one of the things I really liked was kind of the alternative categories, specifically the alternative 2. I don't know who created those categories. I thought they were brilliant, however, just because they do reflect that development process, which I appreciated. So, so there's the different components in production. And also when I'm looking at, so that one. So, because when we're also looking at recommendations, I keep with that lens of production and really what are the things that are really going to maybe help move the dial. But I really liked these 5 categories. I thought it did capture, a lot of, the things that we need to talk about. And again, I thought it was brilliant. I don't know who thought of it, but it does reflect, that development process. So I don't know how we're going to, what the process is to decide the categories, but I really like this alternative too.
Thank you, Robert. Appreciate that. And thanks for whomever's running the screen share for putting that up. You mentioned not sure what the process is. Well, later on in the agenda, we're going to take our first couple passes at consensus building as a group. And we're going to see how successful we are at that. And we're gonna have more information and go from there. I think it is the first part, but yeah, the kind of step-by-step organized lawyer mind that I bring to the table sometimes is it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's the sequence, and we're looking at when do we impact the sequence of development and all those type of things. Next up, Gary Rajabaya.
Yeah, thank you. We have like so many different topics here that we're trying to kind of work through, and makes me feel like we're going through this this forest, right? This woods of all these issues. And for some reason, the Lord of the Rings, going through the forest of Fangorn kind of comes into mind, and we might not make it out of the woods. And building on, Councillor Cody's comments, and also what Councillor Ernesto Fonseca said last time, wonder, whether we should maybe do a little bit of what is it that we're charged with, which is the production, so maybe start with the number that we're asked to kind of come to is quite tremendous, right? So maybe we start with that, so 30,000, let's say 30,000 housing unit. What does that mean? If that is the end goal, we start from that's been done. So what does that mean? How does that distribute into within the next year? How much of the production do we have to have done, right? If we are to really meet the goal, we start with the goal so we don't get lost in these policies. And then maybe we do a backcasting from there to see how we can connect the dots, right? So we are never losing sight of the production part, the number that and that's a huge piece. And I feel like sometimes with tons of these issues kind of happening that we might go through, we'll never get to the number, right? And so something I wanted to kind of just really bring to our focus and not lose sight. So thank you.
Thank you. And that's a very good point, right? Like each of these recommendations, if successful, would impact production by a certain amount on a certain timeline. And so how do we look at these in the aggregate and say, if our, number one, make sure we're using the best information possible, clear-eyed economics, getting all the help that we can from the state's economic office to actually come up with, if this recommendation moves forward and it is successful within whatever parameters, equals X amount of dwelling units. When is it? 5 years, 10 years from now, or what? And then if we're in the aggregate, are we actually even meeting our objectives here? I think that's a big part of where we want to get from between the framework to our final work here later this year. Ernesto Fonseca, go ahead, sir.
Yes, thank you, Chair Hall. My concern remains the same, and I'm going to keep repeating this. I don't really see the need for us to be going through so much process. In my view, I believe that we're going to be tasked with coming up with rapid solutions to treat a real crisis. Last time, I expressed this, and really, all of these, we're really comfy in our chairs, in our offices, while there are so many people out there that are just unhoused. And we are going through more process, over the process, discussing code, zoning, and all of that. And it is absurd in so many ways that we're doing this. In my view, I would think that, we have to do market rate development and affordable housing. We are really good at doing affordable housing, complying with first housing, regulations, complying with, welcoming people between anything between, 30, 60, 120. You give me a number and we'll comply with that. We have the systems. We've been doing this for decades. If we can select sites, set the budget aside, and do a repetition of project over project without having to get permits over and over again, without having to go through that process, overriding, jurisdictions that really don't want to do this, simply do it so we can house people. That's where a real crisis, that's how a real crisis, in my view, should be treated. We are bleeding right here, and we're talking about, we're going to go to Kaiser or Providence if they have a good plan or not. All of these recommendations in the document that you shared, they are, yeah, of course, good recommendations. None of this is new. None of it, should be a surprise to anyone. I don't know. I just don't see the urgency on any of us here, or than going through more process, which is very, very frustrating to me. And obviously, this probably won't go anywhere, these words, but I want to say them because I don't feel that anybody here is taking this seriously. Of course, everybody, we love to say that we're progressive, that we care, that we do, but the results are shown by doing, not by going through more process. I don't want to pontificate, but honestly, I do feel that we're taking this too easily in every concern. So.
Thank you, Ernesto. I want to let you know that I hear that challenge, and I urge the group to take it seriousAs chair, I think, I have the kind of privilege of being about good process, and the part about you thinking that your words aren't going to go anywhere, that's what I honed in on and want to make sure that's not the case. So, translating that urgency and translating what you're saying and the humanistic element of the emergency and crises of people who are actually impacted by this lack of housing into the recommendations of this group, I think that's an important piece. Try to frame this conversation up as what's missing. I think I want to make sure that we're capturing that as what's missing from this set of recommendations. So I don't know the perfect language to capture the very good words of Ernesto there, but if we can take a shot at that, let's do that and not lose that in the shuffle here and all the details of the technical fixes and policy things and all the different things we're trying to push at once.
Yeah, I know, Damian. I just think that, we should, we're on the war, we attack, we defend ourselves, and that's it. We don't have time to be sitting around, planning for so long, in my view. But that's all. All right, thank you, everybody, for listening to my little reflection right there.
Thank you, Ernesto. And please continue to remind us of that throughout this process and everything that you think can be done better. All right, some more hands. Natalie Janney, please.
Thank you. I think that the breadth of recommendations that was put forward is just evidence of how pervasive the problem of developing housing in the state of Oregon is. And so if we're talking about what recommendations we're going to move forward, I think we have to look at all of them because there isn't going to be any one single thing that's going to help ease it. I think we have to look at this as, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And so I think we look at everything. Let's look at it from all angles. And, in terms of like what Ernesto said, I really hear that. And I feel that frustration because as someone who tries to do this every single day, like it feels like we're beating our heads against the wall. But I think, I'm ready to work and I'm ready to do this and I'm ready to make things change. It may not be popular. Like I know a lot of my opinions aren't popular opinions amongst, neighbors and people in the community, but we got to try something. So I'm hoping that the group that we can get forward, get moving, and maybe put out some ideas that are uncomfortable and really like change how we do development in the state.
Thank you, Natalie. Piggyback on that, uncomfortable and disruptive ideas are welcome, encouraged. And so, this isn't, the forum where we solve all the political problems of the world and address every single touch point and come up with the ideas and recommendations and figure out what we can push as far as we can. See, Dan, you got your hand up again, but before we go to you, let me go to Representative Helfrich.
Hey, thanks for having me, and I really appreciate all the comments that we're having and the ideas. If we're going to start land use, that's going to be an uncomfortable conversation. We're really going to have to lean into what we need for production, and I think when we conversation with land production is what's our land stock available currently, and then what is in the urban reserves and rural reserves, and looking at that, because the amount of land that we can build on is limited. And so that's going to have to get that problem from the front, like was suggested, 36,000 units a year. And what does that look like across the state? You know, every region's different. Obviously the coast is different because they've got an ocean, we've got a river, and we've got a couple mountains that inhibit our building here at the National Scenic Area. But that broader work the problem backwards, I think, is going to be the best way to do it. Just from my view, I've been through a couple of work groups at different levels, but also the 4 options and keeping it really simple and coming up with recommendations is, I think that's what's going to really drive this forward, where we can get some work done.
Right on. Thank you. Really agree. You know, one thought that I had, and this will come up in the prioritization conversation when we talk about disruption and things that you know, really cause an impact. It is a bit of a timeline issue, right? Just because of the lead time on any given housing development. We have a challenge that, you know, basically says get it up to the level of production as fast as you can and do it year over year. So as far as however we define near term, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, et cetera, about when our recommendations can be implemented in a way that actually causes more housing development and units to come online, those disruptive things are the ones that get at the front end of that timeline, right? Other building new policy structures and new approaches and all that type of stuff, and bridging, you know, gaps within the, you know, the departments of the state and all that type of thing. That, you know, we'll spend years on the policy of that before we actually get an outcome. So, you know, I do want to say, yeah, there's a chronological element of when disruption can be effective, et cetera. And then I think we've got one more hand up, and then I want to send us to break, keeping in mind that we have on our agenda some decision making after the break about how we want to get into topics and grouping and prioritization particularly, and then how we want to take an initial pass at defining our work groups that'll guide the next at least a couple months of work. So Daniel, Bun, go ahead.
I feel privileged. I got to go first, and now I close the section. I want to speak to Ernesto's point, even though he's not here, because he's 100% right. And I think we need to build into our framework or our charging instructions for the subcommittee 2 different goals. You pick a problem like land use, UGB expansion. I'd like to see the groups come back with 2 solutions. One for a long-term policy fix, and one that can be immediately implemented, even if it's on an emergency basis. So for UGBs, which we're going to get into, the policy fixes, well, we need to make that process better, streamline it, maybe adjust some of the parameters. But on an emergency basis, we could go to the short session next year and say there's going to be a grant, a one-time grant of urban growth boundary based, you know, on 1 acre per 1,000 residents in your city, and it's non-appealable and not subject to priority lands analysis. That's an immediate action that we know will address the problem, to give us time to work on those bigger policy fixes. And I think that probably applies to a lot of the solutions we're looking at. What's something that we can do in the short session by executive order, an emergency rulemaking action, something like that, that we can, when we deliver this report, have actions that will start taking effect immediately to buy us time while we're making the long-term structural fixes. So I hope today we can talk a little bit about, as we deliver this framework, how we want those deliverables to come back to the governor.
All right, thank you. Appreciate that. And Tom Cody, kick it over to you.
Sorry,
the only thing standing between us and break right now, so go ahead.
Sorry, real quick. I think we could be making a big mistake by conflating middle income workforce housing with affordable housing, co-chair. So I think we should be real careful about that, because the way it's laid out in the document is affordable housing development. One of the sub themes is missing middle and workforce. And missing middle and workforce is such a giant opportunity area, precisely because it is not mired in the existing affordable housing system. So for the record, I think that should be broken out and focused on as its own animal.
Absolutely. I go with developers in that space. It is a different thing with different potential funding sources, et cetera. So I'm not seeing any more hands. I just want to give my one observation from the survey before we go to break. Was we didn't have a whole lot of feedback on the workforce things. And it may just because of been the structure of the survey, because you had to choose which elements you wanted to engage on. And we have less, I think, probably workforce expertise than we have development expertise. I'd love to see in our workforce recommendations, a discussion of potentially privatizing traditional local government roles, and also outsourcing. If it stays in local government, that it can, if we need a whole bunch of planners or inspectors or whomever for the things where they don't actually have to be employees of a particular local government, looking at alternatives to that. All right, on that note, let's kick it off to break. I've got 2:23 on my clock. Let's be back at 2:33 and ready to build some consensus around prioritization and work groups. Thank you, folks. Hey, folks, welcome back. I got 2:33 by my clock. As I see videos springing back to life in different boxes, much appreciated. Hope everyone had a good break. Was able to stretch, walk around a little bit, get comfortable. We've got two meaty topics to get through and some decision making to do. First up is the prioritization discussion. After that, we are looking at a discussion about coming to some consensus around what will be the work groups that we start out with. All right, I want to touch in with my co-chair before we kick off here. JD, want to just split these up and you take one and I take one? All right.
Sure, go ahead.
Me. All right. You want work groups?
Sure, yeah, I can do work groups.
All right, good deal. Look at that. We're building consensus already. That's how it's done, folks. All right. So I'll kick us off with prioritization. Step us through kind of, our objectives, and this is listed in the agenda. We need to give guidance to staff basically on how we're going to create a framework to prioritize between the many recommendations that we've already identified, and in the immediate purpose of the direction we're going to give is it's going to go into the framework that we're going to be looking to finalize next week. Again, we will continue to work after that. We will have opportunities to implement this framework, and there will be many discussions that follow as to I'm sure places where it is a less than perfect fit in some scenarios and better in others. So leading into this conversation, I'd like to circle back to the question of, is there anything that anyone would like to exclude? And I say anything, I mean any of the 56 recommendations and counting, I think, that we've identified is, or do we want to keep that all on the table and keep that in the framework and go to the working groups and have those discussions there? This is the opportunity to say there's something that just shouldn't be involved. I'm not seeing any hands. Okay, so that we've got our first group consensus. That's good. So we're moving all of the topics forward. So staff has put some thinking into an initial jumping off point or framework for priorities that I'd like to just run through. And it's this doesn't have to be the thing. There's really 3 items, and if you want, I'm going to seek feedback from everybody. If you'd like to amend those items, add more items to it, by all means, this is the time to go through that. But item 1, for each of the recommendations, prioritize among impact potential, as defined by how many dwelling units would this result in if the recommendation is implemented successfully. Item 2, racial and equitable justice. And item 3 being around feasibility, which takes a number of potential forms around fiscal, political, etc. So with that as a jumping off point for discussion, I would invite the questions, comments, and thoughts of the council members. And quick on the draw is Mr. Joel Madsen. So if you'd like to go first, you're the only hand up at this point.
Thank you, Co-Chair Hall. So I guess I'm concerned that we're missing an opportunity on recommendations, and it's not clear to me, what recommendations we're moving forward. And what I'm concerned about is that we have a list of state agency recommendations. And we have a couple that have been responded to via the survey. And we're missing some. We're missing some from our industry experts. We're missing some from people who have leaned into equity in our work heavily. And there's more. And I feel like we're rushing to get prioritization and to categorize things without having a clear plan on how we're going to be able to lift this up and bring in recommendations in the future.
Thank you for verbalizing that, Joel. I'd point folks to the survey summary, and that just the question of what are the recommendations and what are the different categories of them. Everything in a box is from the state, and everything after that in the outline form is from the responses to the surveys by these committee members. I don't disagree with you, Joel, that if we broaden the world of people taking the survey or world of people involved, that we would get more recommendations. However, I have a pretty clear charge to get this group to a framework by the end of the month. And why, and so the question of that is why, and why is that fast? And that, always going fast is less inclusive, but we know going slow and being deliberative has its own issues as well. But the idea is once we have this framework, we can work on as a group implementing the framework so that we have a more detailed body of work by the end of the year. The idea of the end of the year and that target is that gives us time to translate our work into actions by the legislature in the short session. So that it's a little bit reverse engineered. I agree that we do not have the entire universe of potential recommendations identified. And I want to say that the work group process is not so tightly choreographed or structured that if you come across good ideas or invite experts into the work groups and they present good ideas, that we're going to say, yeah, it's off the table because you didn't have it by March 24th, right? So I think that's kind of my description of where we are in that process. Admittedly, it's not perfect, but that's the approach we kind of have, and ways to optimize. Glad to hear from folks, and and you can always sort of keep running list of anything that you hear from people in your networks, other people that and send those to the chairs and to Matthew and get those involved in the process as well. All right. So just quick reframe. We were talking priorities. There were 3: impact potential based on units, equity and racial justice, and feasibility. Looking for the comments, questions, thoughts of council members. Tom Cody.
Are we limited when we move into work groups? Are we limited to this universe of recommendations? Because some of my recommendations didn't make the list. So, or can we introduce new recommendations? And some of mine were a little spicy, so I understand why they might not be on the list.
Well, I think we want your recommendations on the list, spicy and otherwise. I think that's the first thing. So step one, every recommendation that this group knows about, if it didn't make it on the list, send an email, let's get it on the list, right? Step two is if good ideas rise up during the work group session, we shouldn't categorically say we're not going to think about good ideas, but the idea is to, the objective is to get as many ideas on the table early on so that we can, discuss them and go through the process and include those in our analysis is the right way to do it. Front load the ideas to the extent possible. All right. Riley Hill, sir, go right ahead. Thoughts on priorities and prioritization?
Yeah, I'm struggling with the very first question that I asked the governor at the first meeting was when diversity, equity, and inclusion intersects with production, how do we go with that? Because it seems to me that the production of housing in itself is going to help the DEI that we're striving for, because we're going to make more units available to more people and more diverse groups. However, when I travel, I go around to different parking lots and I see the handicap signs up that are never filled. The sign for the parking lots are never filled. And so I asked the question is, does every unit have to be handicap accessible? Does every unit have to be visitable? Do we have to have all the beauty appointments to every unit that goes along because we're trying to increase production? And somebody made the comment that I saw in our group here that the most expensive housing is government-sponsored affordable housing. And I know that's true. And so how do we get affordability into the picture, meet the DEI requirements that this group is charged with? I'm struggling with all these things, putting all those facts together on how we're going to deal with it. And I haven't got what I call a real good answer. And the governor struggled with it when she answered me the first time.
Fair. And then, to be fair, I don't know what a response was, but it's a very difficult question to answer in the abstract, which is why we're looking at these prioritizations, and we can actually look at a recommendation of a particular policy approach and then use these prioritizations as a metric and then weigh those two things. And because it's not really just affordability and production versus DEI, it's any number of factors as well. But each one of those things is probably best answered with a particular recommendation in mind, as opposed to pitting concepts against each other in the abstract. So anybody else? Hands. Mr. Olson.
Yeah, I would just like to make a kind of general comment about how very often when you're solving a problem, you don't really know, sometimes you don't know what the problem is until you start to delve into the details. And you certainly don't know what the solution is until you begin to sort of explore the maybe a bigger overarching problem. So I do think that we need to be at least cautious not to sort of say that these are the recommendations, because it is I think it's kind of flawed to think that we know with as little as we've sort of begun to sort of penetrate the questions. I think there's going to be an opportunity to come up with potentially better solutions with some flexibility. I mean, I know you're saying there's flexibility, but I think we need to sort of build that into the process, because I think it's going to be absolutely mandatory for us to be able to help move forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eric. And flexibility and then an iterative process where we get feedback both from invited experts and connections and folks within the state departments who would be on for implementation of recommendations, but also from the general public, right? So that's and to remind folks, the first opportunity for extensive feedback and comment from the general public will be when we have a draft framework to send to them. All right. I see that my co-chair has his hand up. JD, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, this is in response to Mr. Hill's comment. It's important to not these are not mutually exclusive from each other. Impact potential, equity, and racial justice and feasibility, those are not mutually exclusive. It's just to make sure that we are specifically looking at that with that lens for that specific item. So there's equity and racial justice and feasibility, as well as an impact potential and cost and complexity and all those other things. And it's just to make sure that we're specifically looking at that, to make sure that we're being cognizant of challenges that arise. I mean, there's 1,000 steps between somebody deciding we need to build a house to actually building a house. there's an entire superstructure around that through title plants, through building codes and design standards and DLCD. There's 1,000 steps in there. And I think it's just really, really important to make sure that we're specifically looking at that entire process from, you know, soup to nuts, or nuts to soup, however that saying goes, to make sure that we're specifically looking at that with that in mind. So it's not to be mutually exclusive.
All right, thank you. Seeing another hand up, Karen Rockwell, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm a little bit confused in this moment because we're prioritizing 130 new suggestions from a group of experts, and we have not had time to vet that or to reach out. I know some of my suggestions that were not included were from some of my resources. So in this moment, I think my opinion is that we would be stronger to say, okay, which work group is going to prioritize these recommendations, and start setting up our work groups and allow us the time to reach out to our constituents and to reach out to our content experts, so that we can then come back with informed decisions based on those additional 130 recommendations that we got yesterday. I think that there is absolutely, and I agree with Ernesto, there's a sense of urgency here, and we do need to be responsible with that sense of urgency. I also agree with Riley that we also need to be very, very inclusive as we continue this conversation about urgency and production and expansion. We are in a state that is extremely environmentally responsible, and we are in this moment where we're weighing the urban growth boundary and how we move next. So I'm uncomfortable with prioritizing without due diligence and vetting, but I'm super on board with setting up work groups so that we can then move the conversation forward.
Got it. And I appreciate that. And so just a process note, we've got this agenda item is not about actually prioritizing the recommendations. I just want to acknowledge that, you know, we all just got these and everyone just took the survey and we're moving quickly. This is about coming up with an initial framework that can be applied by the work groups to the recommendations. So what are the things that we want to identify as priorities so that we can do that weighing amongst the different recommendations, knowing that all of these things have trade-offs, right? You know, we can give all the examples that we want, whether it's DEI, whether it's the number of units, whether it's land use and all of the different competing interests in any given piece of land and how it's zoned, and all it goes on and on and on. What we're trying to do is identify, because there's so many things, we want to identify sort of as a group, if we can, you know, some high points for that are the starting point in discussions. And, you know, and if I can use, if I can take the liberty to give a potential example is, you know, if you go into a future work group, which we're going to decide soon, and that work group has 28 different topics, and you have 3 priorities in which to prioritize those, and everyone says, well, 20 of these really do a great job on the priorities, then you can kind of set those aside as accepted and then talk about the 8 or something like that. So these are really points on which we can make stratification between important recommendations, as opposed to trying to say what is best and what is less valuable, especially right here in this meeting. Okay, so what do we got next? JD, go ahead.
Yeah, I think just to summarize too, we're not prioritizing all of them. We're deciding how to prioritize them as a group. But I do think there is a nugget in what you said as well, is that environmental sustainability as potentially another topic to those 3. the impact potential, equity and racial justice, feasibility, and potentially environmental sustainability. There may be an aspect in there as well that is unique in its ability to prioritize these projects or these topics for research. Is that a fair assessment of what you said, Karen? Okay, maybe that's a fourth topic potentially.
Okay, all right, thank you. Representative Dexter.
Thank you. So I really appreciate the conversation. I also feel the urgency, and I do think process is really important and reproducibility of the process so that it's not people dependent. I would recommend that we create a rubric of, score of 1 to 3, 1, 2, and 3 with, whichever way you want. Low score is better, high score is better, with, relative feasibility. If it's not feasible, like frankly, in a short timeline, I'm not sure how relevant that is, but anyway, and then do that for each score and then start scoring the different ideas and see where that falls out. I think early closure, eliminating things is really, it's not hard to score something and you can see where things start falling out, and then having multiple work groups do the same sort of rubric scoring to see if we're seeing themes between the different work groups. I think groupthink is a real problem, and trying to make sure that we are being as pragmatic as we can. And we also have a public process here that we need to be able to stand by. And so having that element of reproducibility, even though it's still subjective, with an objective score may be helpful. And I would just underline sustainability from my position as a lawmaker. Of course, we could open up the urban growth boundary and throw a bunch of stuff up, but we also are going to have climate refugees and other things in the long term that we need to be planning for. And so I would want us to not look back and wish that we had been more mindful of that 20 years, 30 years from now. Thanks.
Thank you. Duly noted on the second to sustainability as a prioritization, and then discussion about how do we actually apply some quantifiable metric to our prioritization factors. All right, I see 2 hands. Let's go Robert, Justice, and then Natalie Janney.
And I just wanted to support Karen. I really liked what she said. I like the idea. It's kind of hard to kind of splice, some of this, but kind of moving towards the categories and things being put in them. And then I think there's an opportunity as we get organized in these different categories and these groups to meet, to kind of again create a little more, or have recommendations of, what is that, process and how we kind of judge, different items and how that gets organized. And that, so, I think for us at the moment, and I thought Karen said it really well, is, let's get to the categories, and give some freedom there for people to kind of dig in. Because I think, what's missing in this dynamic is, a lot of dialogue, and it's tough to do that with all these people on Zoom, but that's why I'm looking forward to getting to that place where we have our different groups, where can we have some true dialogue and get, also, a lot of wisdom that is, outside of all of us. So anyway, I just want to say, I liked what Karen said.
Likewise, and agreed. And I'm sensing a theme from the council that folks don't want to be boxed in by a decision that we make here today for the rest of the year. And I want to acknowledge that. And I don't want to box you in, but I do want you to make a decision, because we do need to write something down that is called a framework and have it by the end of the month. But it doesn't have to box you in and stop the fruitful discussion and identification of good ideas and letting those rise to the top. That we're going to do later on here in the year. So I just want to provide that reassurance. Natalie, go right ahead.
I had a clarifying question, because the idea of like Riley was saying, can have these different goals and objectives. And sometimes they do compete. And sometimes it's worth it to make the sacrifice for the dueling objectives. One instance would be ADA standards, right? Like I don't think anyone's really suggesting that people with disabilities shouldn't have access to housing or services. But things like that do come with a cost. Sometimes that cost is worth it. Providing services to people, to all people, is worth it. Sometimes those costs, you do need to prioritize them. And so I say this because now the idea of the environment and sustainability has come up a couple of times. And I'm just curious what the group's priority level is, because at some point you do have to make a decision about the environment versus housing. I know again, that's not a comfortable one, and in a perfect world, we could save all the trees and still have homes. But from a practical standpoint, I'm just saying, as an engineer, I'm just curious what the group's like priority is, because at some point there is a trade-off about that. So that was my one question. And then I guess in terms of a framework, I personally am confused what you're asking about right now and what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
That's
so. Matthew, can you throw up that the framework set of boxes real quick, just to recenter us on what is the initial deliverable in our process? Because we kind of start with this framework thing, and we're supposed to do it by next week, and then we break out into groups and are able to have what feels like more meaningful conversation about the nuanced set of trade-offs that come with any one of these recommendations. Okay. So if folks can take a look at that. The yellow box that says March meeting number 4, HPAC adopts a plan framework. That's what we're hoping to do next week. And the framework is each of the things above the yellow box. And we're going one by one through those.
so. Just if I can interject, I don't know if anyone's watched Schitt's Creek, but this is like being asked to fold in the cheese. Like you just fold it in. That's kind of what I'm seeing here. So I need a little bit more instruction on how to fold in the cheese, I guess. I just don't understand what we're doing right now.
So right now we're talking about taking a first pass at identifying issues that we can utilize to prioritize amongst recommendations. We don't need to identify all of the trade-offs between each of the prioritization issues.
Mhm.
We don't need to prioritize between any actual recommendations. We are identifying, and we started out with the list of 3: impact potential, equity and racial justice, and feasibility. And since then, we've had some suggestions and some pushback on environmental and sustainability. And that's where we are. So all we need is a list, and it's not the only things that we can ever talk about for the rest of the year, but it may feel a bit formulaic, but we do need a list of prioritizations that this group hopefully can build consensus around, to include in the framework. And this framework, all this flows from the executive order. So this isn't, arbitrarily, the way we're trying to, fit everybody in boxes right now. We're just trying to get to the framework so we have something that we can put out in the public and discuss and get into the groups and talk about the details and really start moving on this. So, perhaps that it doesn't feel satisfactory, but I hope that helps frame everyone with kind of what we're doing and why I'm pushing with a little bit more immediacy than folks may feel necessarily comfortable with.
Damien,
yeah, JD.
if I could real quick, and maybe another way to frame it is, over the next couple of months, so there's going to be a work group, and these 130 odd recommendations are going to be broken out into each of those work groups because of topical areas. We'll do that next. But those areas will have to be prioritized. And so what we're doing right now is deciding how a unified process for all the work groups to look at their subset of topics and research items to prioritize those. So we're not looking at those, we're not doing that now. We're not doing the prioritization. We're just like trying to jointly decide how we want to prioritize those together. And those are those three, potentially 4 topics that we discussed, is the impact potential, equity and racial justice, feasibility, and environmental sustainability. So it's just kind of a unified framework right now. And then next we'll go into what are those work groups looking like. And then after that, then we'll start assigning people into work groups. And after that, the work groups will get their work assignments to do this, apply this framework to it. Does that help?
Yeah, that does. I got it now.
Okay.
Thank you. And I'm glad you, frankly, we're brave enough to ask, because it's not trying to doing our best to be clear about a process that we're also creating at the same time that we're undertaking it. So by all means, that process questions are welcome, and we want to, as much as possible, keep everybody on the same page as far as each action that we're taking. All right. On that front, so far we're looking at, we've had the 4 listed prioritization considerations. We've got a couple more hands up. We've got a little bit more time to talk about this. We scheduled till 3:30 on these prioritizations before we hop into work groups, I believe. So hands are up. Justin Wood, go ahead.
Oh, actually, sorry, I kind of meant to take mine down. I think Natalie was going down the same path that I was going for it, but I think I'm good for now.
All right. Daniel Bunn, go ahead.
First of all, thanks to Natalie for asking the question. I now know what I'm supposed to be talking about. Kudos. I think we have to trace all of our prioritization rubric to the executive order. And if you go to paragraph 9, it is very clear what our deliverables are. So our rubrics I think, need to be directly tied to how much housing does this action produce? How does it respond to affordability? And is it, skewing towards the place where there's a deficit? And is it produced, and I'm just reading from the order, spatially in a way that is equitable and affirmatively furthers fair housing? That's what we're charged to do. There's all sorts of other public policy considerations that implementing these actions will have, like climate, like environment. That's not our job. Our job is to deliver a recommendation. And I like UGB because it's contentious and everyone understands it. We might say, let's loosen the UGB rules. There is a balancing test to be made there in public policy for environmental protection, conservation versus housing versus economics. But that happens in the legislature. That doesn't happen here. Our job is to be subject matter experts and to give a basket of solutions. And then we let the policymakers do that balancing of competing public interests. Because I think if we get bogged down into what is the best for society overall, we're just going to turn into a shadow legislature. And with all due respect to our legislative colleagues who are here on the committee, I think part of our charge is to try and quickly and clearly cut through that type of debate and come up with technical solutions. So that's all by way of saying, I think for the public process, environmental analysis, climate analysis is important. I just don't know that it's directly within our scope to be on a scoring rubric equal with housing production. And that's based on how I read the executive order.
Well, thank you for that. And that just want to frame that up as an alternative is to use the language and specific call outs in the executive order as the prioritization issues. All right, JD, you got your hand up?
I agree, but I think there's also a limit to that. It's like building, like, let's get rid of the rules against building houses on steep slopes. That's that might provide a lot of housing, it might provide a lot of space for housing, but we know it's not going to go anywhere. It shouldn't go anywhere. In fact, it shouldn't go anywhere for building houses on super steep slopes. So I want to make sure that we're also being kind of moderated in that we're not just saying let's throw out safety protocols for the sake of building houses.
Well, and to that point though, maybe that's part of our framework is when the committee kicks those up, your columns are, here's what's good, here are the risks associated with it, because all of these solutions do have risks. And I think you're right, that's going to come up in our conversations. I think we should make a point of documenting that. So when it gets to a decision maker, they can understand what the balancing test is.
And I think that, and I don't mean to jump in, but I think we also talk about what are the deliverables going to be as part of the work groups providing over the next few months. And some of that is like timeline, potential costs, things like that. And that could potentially be like another column that is assessed by each of the work groups as what is the potential risk of that. So I'm with you on that.
Yeah, agreed. And to be fair to everybody, we don't need to capture the perfect set of 5 potential priorities. There are subsets and competing issues, and we will debate them mightily, I believe, in these work groups. So next up, Alyssa Kurtler, please go ahead.
Oops, sorry about that. I've sat through a lot of public processes. I've either staffed or been on a lot of advisory committees in my life. And I'm kind of the mind of like, we're an advisory committee. We're not the implementers, even though we all implement it. And so I do think we want to stay in our lane as an advisory committee to advise those who are going to implement and hold accountable the implementation. And so I'm also of the mind, like, if everything's important, then nothing's important. And there does need to be some kind of sense of prioritization. And I'm actually hearing that from others in this room too. Like, let's prioritize. I thought Representative Dexter's idea of sort of, giving at least some weighting, even if it's not a mathematical score, allows us to sort of array recommendations that can be used by either the policymakers or the implementers, that then allow us to sort of play that advisory role of, this is most important, this is why we think it's most important, this is why it rose to the top, even though there's 60 other things that could have also risen to the top. So I kind of like the development process outline, just because I think it captures really almost everything we're saying here, even though there's clear overlap. And in every meeting, I'm the one who points out how they all overlap. So I feel like we should stop overthinking the rubric and start getting into the content. I guess I just want to, as somebody who loves process, like, I think we're almost done with this part, if we can get to consensus here. And then the only other thing I wanted to say is, I represent the North Coast. I represent places with wetlands and tsunamis and landslides, but I've also spent a decade, guarding the UGB in the metro area. And what I will say is, environmental sensitivity is not about not allowing development. It's actually, I think what somebody's JD Chair Tovey said, like, it's about allowing it in a way that's safe for people who we're trying to serve, that recognizes that you can expedite permitting, but in Seaside, we're putting homeless people in tsunami zones, and that seems like a really ill-advised approach. So I just want to say, like, to me, environmental sensitivity is not about constraining development. It's about understanding the places in which we're trying to make it happen. So those are my thoughts.
Right on. Thank you, Alyssa. All right. On this other hand, maybe someone put it down. All right. So I'm not seeing any more hands. It's an opportunity for folks to weigh in. Otherwise, we're going to take a run at, building a consensus around a set of priorities. And right now, we seem to have 2 options. Option 1 being the initial set of priorities proposed and come up with by staff around impact potential, that specifically meaning units produced, equity and racial justice, And then feasibility, which has a number of factors, I think primarily about political and costs. So those three. And then option 2 is cut and paste what we want from the words of the executive order. Before everyone says, oh, what about environmental? If we go with option 1, I'm gonna follow up with a discussion about environmental, but I'm not gonna do that unless we go with option 1, all right? So, I am going to, oh, I'm seeing a hand. Justin, go ahead.
Well, it was just me. I was only thinking that option 2 seems like a little bit of a cop out to just go right back to where we started from the governor's executive order. So it seems like option 1 is from a very high level. I can see that those 3 things can at least be a lens that we can look at everything through. I'm gonna just say this now so I don't get back in the line again. But when you get to the topic of whether or not environmental or whatnot should be a part of option 1. I think environmental is encapsulated in feasibility. I mean, I don't think it needs to be its own line item. I mean, as we're discussing issues, if we're looking at something, whether it's UGB or codes or whatever like that, if there's challenges to that, I think that comes up during the feasibility discussion of the thing, and it could be environmental. So I personally don't think that needs to be its own line item, because I think if we start pulling out own line items, then that's just subcategories of feasibility, in my opinion.
Right on. Thank you, Justin. And appreciate those points. So back to option 1, impact potential, equity and racial justice, and feasibility. Option 2, language from the executive order. So I guess I'm going to ask folks to use your raise hand button for voting. And Matt, I don't know if it's you, but I'm going to need help counting people and figuring out what everyone's doing here when we ask everyone to vote. So if someone can assist me with that, that would be great. And before we do, I've got a hand up from Senator Kasijama. Senator, please go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just testing when you said raise your hand. So.
Oh, okay. Well, the system is working. And so let's start, because I framed them option 1 and option 2. Let's start with option 1 again: impact potential, equity and racial justice, and feasibility. If you prefer option 1, please raise your hand.
Please keep your hands up.
Yeah.
Until I call you, and then you can take it down. Daniel, Justin, Joel, Ari, Natalie, Senator Anderson, Ivory, Corey, I got you. Eric, Representative Dexter, Karen, Melissa, Erica, Tom, Senator Jama, Representative Helfrich, Co-Chair Hall. Okay, I got everybody who voted for 1.
Okay, let me figure out how to put my hand down here. Okay, got everyone that voted for 1. Would we now raise your hand if you'd like to vote for option 2, which is utilize the language of the executive order of the governor to determine the priorities?
All right. Deborah, Margaret, Riley, Rob, Ernesto, Ivory, did you vote twice?
I think so.
Great. Okay, I got everybody. We're missing a couple people. I may have missed a couple people. Which first, Director Bell?
Option 1.
Thank you. Co-Chair Tuvey?
Option 1.
Okay. We have $18 for option 1, $5 for option 2.
Okay. So we don't necessarily have bylaws about majorities and supermajorities and things like that, but we have, what I would say is, close to a consensus, if not a consensus, around option 1. So following on to that is, I would like to again ask folks to make a choice up or down on whether or not we want to have a discussion about adding priorities to the 3 that were identified as option 1. And I don't want to have an up and down vote on environmental and say that there's only one other thing here, but do we want to have a discussion about adding on to those 3 priorities in option 1, or do we want to stand pat with 3 priorities in option 1? The idea being that all the way that those 3 priorities are framed, there are any number of subtopics in any one of those things that we can all get into in the work groups, including whatever anyone else's issues of priority and focus in your professional lives and levels of expertise. Do we want, so question is, stick with 3 items or add to 3 items, add more items? Okay, so I'm going to ask folks if you want to stick with impact potential, equity and racial justice, and feasibility as the 3 items and again, these are the items to include in the framework. These are not the only things that we can talk about in our work groups for the duration. So if you want to stick with those 3 items, I'd encourage folks to raise your hand now to vote yes.
All right. Daniel? Natalie? Joel? Margaret?
Thanks, Ernesto.
Senator Anderson? Richard Tuvey? Justin? Karen? Lisa? Eric? Deb? Damian, Ivory? Erica? Senator Jama? Rob? Director Bell? Representative Dexter? Quarry? Riley? Representative Helfrich? Tom? Okay, that is Ernesto. Did Ernesto have a vote?
Ernesto said he was going to send comments and he had to step away. He had held to sign that book.
If that's the case, then everybody voted for that.
Okay, unanimous. That's a true consensus. All right. So I think, unless I missed something, that we have the priorities we need to include in the framework, and we're done with this particular agenda item. And I want to thank everybody for their patience and understanding as we navigate this process, and encourage folks to speak up the way Natalie did when, if I'm being pushy and it's not clear why or what it is that I'm asking the group to do, please, by all means, stop me, tell me to slow down. Your feedback is well taken, but congrats. First exercise of consensus. I appreciate it. And I'll turn it over to JD to talk us through work groups, please.
Great. Thank you, Co-Chair Hall. We are about 7 minutes ahead. I would maybe want to offer a 5-minute break, maybe. We have about a half hour left. Does people want to go take a walk around the desk and maybe 5 minutes? Margaret says no. Or do you just want to plow through? I'm seeing more nods for plowing through. Okay, we'll keep plowing through. So we've got through that process on what our framework is. This next objective is to try to develop the work groups. This will be the teams that you're mostly working with for the rest of the year. But right now we're just going to be looking at what those work groups are. And Matt, do you want to go over the existing categories, that map or the PowerPoint with the existing categories and those alternative 1, 2, 3? We'll just talk through each of those.
Yes, and Co-Chair Tevye, do you mind if I just put something up for folks that I think might be a bit more visual before I do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So just to kind of, it sounded like folks maybe wanted a little bit more clarity on kind of where we are and where we're going. So I put this together just to help folks as we go into the next topic. So this is just, as simple as I can put it, what we need for the plan framework for next Friday's meeting for end of the month. So the objectives and the timelines, the high level objectives and timelines for the council are in the EO. We got the shared agreements and the principles in the second meeting. We got the topics that the work groups will focus on from the survey. And just a note on that, a couple folks said that they didn't see their responses reflected in the condensed version. It was not to filter anything out. We were just trying to make it more readable by taking 30 pages of responses and bringing it down a bit. So if you specifically think that yours didn't get captured in one of the groupings, send me an email and I'll make sure to explicitly add it, or if you think it's grouped incorrectly. So just want to make that clear because I think a couple people mentioned that. The work groups is something we'll need, which is the conversation Co-Chair Tevye is facilitating now. From this meeting, we'll need to assign topics to whatever the work groups end up being, which is something that staff can do after this. You all can do it in this meeting if you'd like, but staff can take a first swing at it after this meeting and bring it back to you next Friday for finalization, which is what I would recommend. You just identified the factors for how the work groups will prioritize the topics assigned to them. And I think those are the 3. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I was typing this up and counting votes at the same time. And then finally, we'll need to assign HPAC members to work groups and identify chairs. And so a survey will be sent out after this meeting for folks, asking folks to identify what work groups they're interested in order of preference. The goal is to try and get everybody in one of their top preference work groups. And then the co-chairs and the governor will work to assign out members to work groups and select the chairs for those work groups. So just wanted to put that up there for some folks that needed some something to look at to understand the kind of last pieces we're checking off. So then I can bring up, thank you for that, Co-Chair Tevye. I'll bring up the slide deck that has the alternatives that folks had suggested. And walk everybody through it. So these are the categories that we grouped the topics in, simply because these were the categories from the existing recommendations. So we just grouped the existing recommendations as they were in these categories and then tried to put the new topics into them based on the survey response. Again, in the survey, somebody proposed an alternative that we take out affirmatively further fair housing and integrate it into each of the remaining 5 topics as one alternative. A second alternative was to create the work groups. So the work groups and the categories based on the process for the housing development process. So land, entitlement, codes and design, workforce, and then ownership and financing. And then I would say that alternative 3 and alternative 4 are similar to alternative 2, just different categories or different orders, right? So 3 is land use, and then design and permitting, then code, labor force, and then land availability. And the 4th is just 4 categories: land supply, process, financing, and workforce.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to kind of go through this. What I did was I took all 4 of these options, or 5 options, the existing plus the 4 options, and kind of just put them out on a spreadsheet and try to like group and see, rather than like picking one of these 4, I would rather go through and like pick the 4 or 5 we want. And as part of the first exercise, the first thing that kind of really pops out amongst all of them is workforce. And I guess maybe if everyone's okay with this, if we kind of go through with that process, is like, let's identify that is common amongst all of them, get that put away and say, okay, we all agree to that as a work group, and then go through it down through each of these individual items. And then some of them will kind of be shaken out and there'll be a few left. We can decide, can these be grouped together as something else, or as a separate work group. Is everybody okay with that? What's that process? Okay. So the first 2 that I have that seems to be universal across all 5 of these is workforce development, either labor shortage, labor force, workforce development. It's a pretty common theme across all 5 of them. So I will probably do a quick hand raise for everybody to see if everyone's okay with including workforce as one of our groups. And I'm hoping we get a pretty universal. I'm going to defer to Matt if he even wants to count, because I don't know if anyone's not going to agree with that one.
You could also do a negative poll. Does anyone want to raise their hand who doesn't agree?
That is true too. Well, let's do this real quick and see if there's anybody who does want to not include workforce as a specific area.
All right. Senator Anderson. Karen.
Sorry, is this a negative poll right now or a positive? There was a conversation of both.
Positive poll. Positive poll. Do you want workforce development, labor force development as a work group?
Daniel. Riley. Deborah. Eric. Damian. Representative Dexter. Rob. JD. Ivory. Director Bell. Natalie. Erica. Alyssa. Justin. Joel. Gary. Representative Helfrich. Okay.
I just have one little comment here. It seems like the one possible problem is, if we're doing it one by one, it's not really a linear process, because one might sort of push another one from being required in the group. So it seems a little bit wiser to maybe do it as a package rather than doing it individually, because they're all somewhat related. And if you include affordable housing, for instance, that might then say, well, we also want some other topic to make sure that we cover market housing, for instance.
Agreed. And what I wanted to try to do on this is at least get the kind of the unique categories that were at least identified. Let's at least include that, because I do, like, I have kind of my set of notes here, and I have a whole slew of like other items on here that are workforce, missing middle, affordable development, market rate, low income housing as kind of a separate thing that I mean, those are very important, but I think that might be a different process to like select those as a conversation. I'm just trying to get some very clear, more unique topics that can be identified as something that we want to focus on. So I hear you, and I absolutely agree. I probably should have explained that a little bit before. So let's do the negative of that. Those members who do not want to include workforce development as a work group topic.
Margaret.
Right, and if I may, I'll invite, you know, Tom and Margaret. Is there some reason why, or I don't know. I just want to make sure that you're heard, and make sure that we're addressing any concerns if you think it might actually belong somewhere else.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Margaret.
For me, I just think that there's one of the other more linear, I can't remember what they were, but I know I liked the one that didn't include that. That was more about the process, the development process. So I don't object to it. I think it's one of those, we have to pick the things we're going to spend time on.
Okay.
And I don't know that this group has the chops, the expertise to do workforce.
I just don't think it's going to move the needle anytime soon. I think it's absolutely necessary. We need to get more people in the trades, but it's, you know, it's going to be about funding to community colleges and vocational programs and things like that. And I just think those things take a lot of time. And I'm more interested in like what can produce 10,000 more units by 2024, you know, kind of stuff. And but I think it would be a good long-term investment.
Okay. Karen?
I agree. And I was kind of waving back and forth a little bit. One of the things that I kept thinking is, please don't put me in that work group. Please don't put me in that work group, because that's not what I'm here for. I'm a developer. And I can tell you where I'm having deficits in employment and in subcontractors, but I'm not upper education. And that is not represented in this group at all. So I do think that if we're talking about what our wheelhouse is and where our expertise is, I wholeheartedly agree that we have a shortage that needs to be shored up. And if we do create that work group, please don't put me in it. Please don't put me in it.
Great. Thanks, Justin.
The only thing I was going to add, and I know when we talk about workforce, where most of us are thinking trades or whatnot, but I was talking with somebody at management of the city of Portland the other day that I think the number they said is about a third of their staff in development review and permit review is eligible to retire. And so when I look at workforce development, quite honestly, the thing that scares me the most is we can say we want to build 30,000 houses a year, but if we can't figure out where the next levels of plan reviewers, building reviewers, and building inspectors is going to come from, this problem is going to get worse.
And maybe that work group ends up actually just identifying some of the shortfalls, and maybe it doesn't necessarily have the expertise. We can potentially work with Matt and others to actually bring in some more of that expertise, and maybe that work group can work specifically with, you know, Department of Labor and education and things like that to maybe come up with some recommendations. I know we did not hear from those necessarily hear from all those departments, so that might be an opportunity for additional research, I think, too. This isn't the research portion of it doesn't end in the end of March. I mean, I think it's mostly just beginning actually on the 1st of April. Mr. Hill.
Thank you. Yesterday I just held a meeting in Ontario with a representative from Bully and some general contractors from our area and some electricians, electrical contractors. And they all agree that there's a bottleneck. If we don't get more electricians and plumbers and tradespeople, we're not going to build those additional houses. It's just not going to happen. And so we have an aging workforce. We have people, the 2008 crisis came, nobody went into the trades. And so now we have an aging workforce, and we're going to have to develop those through, I'm trying to get an apprenticeship program going at the high school, and our school district has agreed to do that if we can get past the bully roadblocks. So I just think we have to have the workforce for the future. But to do it we have to start sometime. And putting it off to later to different ones, it's not helpful to the 10-year project. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Deborah?
Chair Tovey, I would just say that I understand that it might not be everyone's expertise here. I agree with Riley that we are 13,000 trades short in order for us to hit these goals that have been put together to hit the 36,000. And it's going to get worse. I'm happy to serve on 2 committees. I would love to be on another committee, but I will also serve on this one because I think it's needed.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. We do have a vote, and so I think it is. I just want to make sure that those who really didn't vote for it, or make sure they're heard, so we make sure we have those concerns addressed. I think they are very valid concerns, and I think having the capacity within this committee to just make recommendations or at least identify challenges, I think is going to be I think powerful, even if we can't necessarily provide full-throated recommendations on how to solve those. I think it's going to be very difficult to solve. So, but I think it's the best we got. So we kind of keep moving forward. The other item on this, oh, go ahead, Thomas.
Sorry, Chair Tovey, the only question I would like to throw out there for the group is this, affordable housing is 60% and below. It's not 80% and below, as far as I know it. That meaning there's tools and things and it takes too long and costs too much, but that's affordable. Market rate housing, depending on what census tract you're in, is what commonly considered 120 and above. I do think this 60 to 120 is such a giant opportunity area. Should that be a work group?
Absolutely, and that's on my list. So I absolutely agree. So, Joel?
Co-Chair Tovey, and if I could just respond to that. From my perspective, that's an incomplete definition of affordable housing. And a more complete definition for affordable housing for me includes a product that is specifically affordable to a designated income level of our area median income for a specified period of time.
Joel, I'm going to hold off on you for just one second because we are going to get to that discussion. I'm just focusing, we'll just work on workforce as a topic for a work group right now. And I have the types of housing as potential workforces. That'll be a full discussion for all of us here shortly.
Perfect, thank you.
I didn't mean to jump off. I just want to make sure we keep everything kind of in order. The next item, so looking at across all 5 of these recommendations, the 4 alternates plus the existing, the other one that does seem at least consistent through all of them is land use permitting. And I grouped in building codes and the process kind of in that, because that is where the process is land use and permitting. And then there was a mention earlier today about building codes, is that I can't remember who it was, whoever recommended building codes, they really kind of felt like it meant more the land use and the building process, but I think it's something that could be included here. So potentially land use, building codes, and permitting. If everyone's okay with that kind of definition or that grouping, and I see some nodding heads, as something that seems to be universal across the entire process or across those entire 5 recommendations. So I want to have a quick conversation about if that grouping is okay, and then we'll have a vote on whether or not that is something that should be included as a separate work group. You want to go ahead, Deborah?
Thank you, Chair Tovey. I think that those are different categories. On the development side, there is the land use side. And then when you actually get into the entitlement section, you actually have entitlements, which is going through the process of the neighborhood meetings, the the public comment, all of that aspect. And then that leads into, once that's actually been approved, then you go into the land development side. And that's a whole nother section. It's engineering and land development. Once that's done, then you actually go into the building code side of actually submitting a permit. So there's actually 4 sections there. And I think 2 of them are very, I mean, they're all very complicated, but they are very different.
Right, but it's a holistic process from beginning to end. Do you think they're still different enough that they're not part of a single process from beginning to end?
Yes, I think that they're different.
Okay. Natalie?
And you could, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, go ahead, Deborah. Okay.
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of comment. It depends, like when you say land use, it depends if you're talking about the land use process going through the neighborhood meeting, or you're talking about the land use criteria, which dictate how you design your project. So I think it's kind of 2 separate things. If you could put in the development criteria in with engineering, I think, or with the design portion of it, I think that makes more sense. Because then you could tackle the land use process and the challenges like NIMBYism and that come with that. And so that was kind of, I could see, because otherwise, if you put land use, all of permitting and all of building codes, that's a lot. That's a lot of stuff in one group. And so I think maybe you could take out the process of getting your land use approval, but keep the development criteria in with the rest.
Correct, and I'm a planner, so my idea of land use is the land use system, the UGB, the development process, how it's promulgated down to the lower jurisdictions. So perhaps I had a different definition of what land use is. My comprehensive land use is the land use system, and DLCD and the entire process of either getting a permit, going to a hearing, getting the development review, having a design criteria applied, and then going on to getting a permit. So, and maybe other people have a different opinion of what land use is, or at least a portion of it, because that's what I'm hearing. So maybe I assumed wrong about what people's understanding of what land use is.
I think just clarification clarification is all. Yeah.
Okay. Justin?
Thanks, Chair Chubby. At a minimum, I mean, I think development, and it could include land use, that the front end stuff up until we submit for actual building permits to build a house are completely 2 different things. I consider myself an expert in building permits and do way more stuff than that. I know nothing about land use stuff. So if you put me on a land use development side of things, that's just not my forte. And I think that applies to a lot of people who build infill stuff, Portland, city of Portland, stuff like that, because we're just not messing in that realm. So it feels like it's at least 2 parts to it, development, land use, and building permit regulation code type stuff. Seems like they're 2 separate entities.
Okay, and thank you for that, because I think I just wanted to show how my process was on this, is that each of the existing and the alternates have different titles in recommendations for the breakdown. Some of them include land use, some of them include availability of land, some of them include codes and design. And so I was trying to find a kind of a common language through all of them. Even if it is a large group, maybe it does need to be 2 groups. Maybe just like the land use system, like the capital land use system, might be 1 group just to look at that process. And then it's more of like on the ground permitting processes might be something separate. I don't know. I just wanted to say, because if we went to the other recommendation of just voting on each one of these 4, we're going to end up with very, very different types of groupings that are going to be completely missing different parts, because they're not incorporated into these definitions that we've now just discussed. So I'm kind of stuck in the center here where to move forward. So I'll defer to Damien for a quick interjection.
Yeah, thanks, maybe one solution might just be from the way that the themes from the survey were categorized. There's land use and zoning, and that's separate from building codes and inspections. So it's more the land usey stuff, the more technical stuff where you got your design elements and your engineering and all that type of thing. Might not be a perfect split that categorizes everything and there's clearly overlap, but it might be something we could build consensus around.
Right. Natalie.
The only issue I see with that is there's a whole step in the middle between building codes and land use. And so I just don't know where that fits in with that. And I don't want that to get lost, because that's where a majority of the time that it takes to get a development done lives, is that engineering part. So I'm happy to have land use development criteria in with that engineering part, because the development criteria has a direct impact on how you design it. But I just don't want to get, like, I just don't want that middle part to get lost.
Okay. Deborah?
Chair Tovey, if you look at alternative number 2, I do think it captures the main areas in the top 3 sections: the availability, the entitlement, and the codes and designs. I would recommend that it's a little bit more descriptive in regards to availability of land would be, discussions of UGB expansions, something like that, or etc. Entitlement process is actually broken into 2 different areas. One is the entitlement section and the process to go through with the neighborhood meetings, the NIMBY aspect, etc. And then there's also the development side. So it's talking about specifically the engineering and the development standards of etc. So those would be 2 different sections, and they're both big. And then the 3rd section would be talking about building codes. So discussing, the actual building code and submitting for a building code and the design, architecture requirements, etc. So in those 3, I think that kind of explains the different areas.
I would agree, but I would posit that alternative 2 also is missing a lot of the affordable development, market development, and missing middle development. And so that's why I didn't really want to go vote on each one of these, because we'd be missing large chunks of other things. And so, yeah, so I do agree with you and like that, but I think that some other people had made strong recommendations about the types of housing being developed needing to be as specific topics of study as well. Gary?
Yeah, so I work on, as a designer at Serra Architects, I do a lot of the front end land use that is not to the permitting part. And I agree with Deborah that it is very, very different. Each is a pretty complex thing on its own. But I also wanted to kind of highlight what Natalie brought up, the part that is in between. So working with a lot of the BIPOC developers in rural areas, a lot of the part of the land use piece is with the infrastructure development, which kind of tends to carry that public works, but sometimes it's even much more in depth than that, right? Like having to develop right-of-way systems and stuff that does not necessarily pertain to the particular development itself, the permit itself. But then that piece of the permitting kind of straddles both sides. And we really have to be careful because those are some of the costs where a lot of the cost kind of, becomes very hard to contain and something to kind of really keep in mind. That said, I do want to make sure that on the housing typologies and stuff, we do keep that in mind. And also one of the things I haven't seen much is the transitional housing, that particular part, the front line. And that part also, somehow we need to kind of figure out where that falls. So thanks.
Natalie.
Just to kind of touch on the different housing type, you're concerned about that. From my point of view, all types of housing, no matter which type, if it's affordable, middle income or market rate, all has to go through the exact same land use criteria and the exact same design standards. And so if we can hone in on the processes that go to getting one of those, to getting any project through and make that quicker and more efficient and less costly, that impacts all types of housing. It doesn't matter what type it is. So I would say my opinion is we can with alternative 2, we can have that kind of grouping, and we can look at all the different housing types within each group to make sure that they meet that equitable lens priority that we just set up. So I don't know, that's my perspective on that. Yeah.
I like that. I like that take. So we have about 7 minutes left. Let's Natalie, your hand's still up, or Margaret? Oh, there you go. Margaret, you're on mute. There you go.
Sorry about that. So I want to sort of thumbs up to what Natalie and Deborah just said. And I would propose that we do number 2, but separate out the ownership and financing one that's at the bottom of that, into make financing its own thing. Or maybe it's a financing for affordable and then financing for everything else. And when I say affordable, I mean capital A, affordable, 60% and less, and deed restricted. So I want to just kind of strongly support the idea that we keep it a little bit simple, go with number 2, maybe expand to a separate group that could look at the affordable financing stuff, because there is a lot inside how the affordable housing finance system works that is bogged down and very time consuming. And so if we can expedite any of that, that's worth its own sort of focused set of strategies. And then maybe let the groups really kind of define from there what they want to do. But I think I agree with Natalie's that all the stuff we're talking about that gets bogged down is captured in there. So.
Okay. Daniel.
Well, Margaret stole all my good points. So I agree with her and I agree with Natalie, but really to hit on financing is what covers the different, tranches of housing that we'll look at for affordability, and none of the other alternatives hit that financing piece. And so I think number 2 is the way to go. Does it need to be split? I could go either way on that. I think Margaret's right. There's a lot of work to be done on the kind of textbook affordable stuff. I think that'll probably dominate the work if we leave it combined, but I don't know that there's a lot of work to do for financing on market rate. The market kind of figures that out. So I don't know that it's a problem if you keep them together.
Okay. Eric. You're on mute. Eric.
Oh, sorry about that. I think 2 captures definitely the whole process. The one thing I might add to the financing piece, I think it needs ownership and tenants. We don't want to exclude tenants in the, when we're looking at ownership, I think it needs to obviously include any sort of rent subsidies and that kind of thing when we're looking at the, who's actually living there. It's not just for home ownership.
Good point. Deborah?
In regards to the financing, I guess my question is does this also include like infrastructure financing? Or is this just affordable financing? Because I do, to Tom Cody's point about this affordability, right now we have financing that is really focused on 60% and below. And I do agree with Tom that there is an opportunity between the 60 and 120 to actually get housing produced at either very low subsidy or less subsidy than what we're spending on the 60%. And I think that would be an opportunity for us to look at it on the financing piece.
And I would think maybe it makes sense to have the financing be more general just to financing. And then even if it's a large team, that team we can coordinate and actually have sub teams and working on different aspects of it. But I think, it's kind of my thing back to land use is it might be a, soup to nuts kind of thing. So I'm hearing a lot of people kind of circling around option 2. Perhaps in the interest of time, we have about 3 minutes left. Perhaps we just start with a vote on option 2 with that and see if everyone wants to vote for that, and we'll kind of go down the list. I want to open the floor up to anybody who wants to make an argument for any of the other ones, and specifically, and Yeah, if anybody wants to do that first before we go into some voting.
Hey, JD, Damien here. I think
Yep.
one other potential option is to take this feedback, try and incorporate, because everyone's made a lot of good points and we're just trying to incorporate a structure that can logically capture all of those conversations and topics, right? So can we take that feedback, come back with 1, 2, or 3 options? Because I've heard everyone say each of these options is missing something. And then come back to that next Friday. Matt, does that kill our timeline and agenda and process, or can we accommodate?
A little bit, it does.
All right, let's vote it then.
And well, let me maybe put another caveat on that, because similar to what we did prior is voting on number 2 or any of these, and then focusing on that and how it needs to be modified to more broadly capture what people are saying is missing. And then we can go on that. And then even throughout the entire, during the rest of the year, I mean, obviously then we're going to populate each of these topics and each of these work groups with a lot of these objects, and then how that filters out may take a different path than what is kind of predicted here. Justin.
I was just going to echo what you said, JD, that it seems like, at least for a framework, for a place to start, that then the work groups can say, hey, now that we're into this, we feel like we're going to need to do 2 separate ones off of this, or we're going to delve into some other things, and we can let that steer itself. So I support option 2. It's just a place to get us started.
So again, I'll open the floor up to anybody who wants to make an argument for any of the other ones or the other options. And if not, Justin, your hand's still up. There you go. So with that, let's go ahead and have everybody vote for those who want to use alternative 2 as a starting point for our work group development.
Daniel. Natalie. Joel. Justin. Rob. Barry. Tom. Ivory. Margaret. Deborah. Erica. JD. Eric. Karen. Melissa. Riley. Damien. Representative Helfrich. Representative Dexter. Senator Jama. Okay. And then we're missing Senator Anderson, if you're still with us. I'm not seeing Senator Anderson. And then Director Bell, if you're still with us. You may have had to drop off before. Okay. And that is everybody who's still on the meeting.
Okay, sounds good. And so some of the notes that I kind of took about the conversation about those topics, one was specifically around the ownership and financing. Well, let me step back. Is the housing typologies, missing middle, affordability, and market rate, as something that we wanted to look at across all of these. Availability land for all of those typologies, entitlement process for all those processes or all those typologies, code and design, workforce and ownership and financing. Is everyone comfortable with kind of making that as a kind of a universal thing that each of these topics need to look at? I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding. That sounds good. Then the other area that seems to be kind of a focus is the last one, the ownership, the quote, ownership financing. The notes I had on this is to include rentals in there, as well as potentially splitting financing from like a consumer financing to like commercial financing or even infrastructure financing. Should that be one topic of financing, all inclusive, or should those be multiple types of financing for those 3 large groupings of financing, or some other splitting? And I'll start with Representative Helfrich, sorry. I think their hand is still up from voting earlier. Okay, I'll go to Margaret.
I just wanted to clarify the way I read the word ownership in the context of that grouping is ownership of the property, not homeowner versus renter. So ownership and financing is often a way we describe sort of the legal structure that underpins a housing development, whether it's apartments or homes or a subdivision or what have you. So just, I don't want anybody to, I didn't write this, but my understanding, I don't want anybody to think that that means we're not thinking about renters in the context of ownership in the way it's written here. So just wanted to clarify.
So ownership is in like the ownership of the property, but not necessarily the infrastructure or the commercial lending.
Like the legal structure that then has to go borrow or get tax credits or go through the entitlement process. Whoever it is, whoever's the owner that's doing that.
Okay. Daniel?
Yeah, I think you're talking about the entity that is getting the financing. And I think they need to be paired together. And I think to your question about financing, when we're talking about infrastructure or affordable or market, I think those should stay together in the same work group because there is going to be a lot of commonality. I spend my life in real estate finance, and there's more overlap than you would think at first glance, which is good. So I'd hate to see those segregated because I think there's some opportunity to get those different types of financing to play off of each other and find some common solutions. So I like grouping it together. I don't think it's any bigger of a remit than looking at the entitlement process. I think those folks are going to have the most work. So as someone hoping to get on this committee, I think having the second most work is perfectly fine.
So is your recommendation just to call it financing period? Would that help with the clarity?
I would be fine with that because in my mind, financing includes the legal structures of do you have a special purpose borrower? Do you have LIHTC with a limited partnership? All that junk. That's all financing. It's just the mechanics that flow from it. And I think financing is the important part because tracing back to the executive order, it's how can we, there's a question about how can we make investments to achieve these goals. Investments means financing, and financing is how do we deploy that money in the most effective way possible.
Deborah?
Daniel, does that also include SDC fees then? It would be included in that section?
I think it has to the, yes, I think it does. Because finance, I mean, it's a big cost up front, and that's a big part of how you have to finance it if you don't have your debt yet.
Eric? You're on mute again.
Sorry about that. So Daniel, would you also include, so both from the consumer side, financing from the consumer side, as well as from the sort of the owner side?
I think so. I think it's all the sources and uses of capital.
Yeah,
so I think like going back to the SDC question, it doesn't cover SDC methodology or how you set the SDC. It covers how it gets paid. Now, but you got to watch me. I'm a bit like Alexander Hamilton. I think everything relates to money, and so financing touches everything. So you got to put the wall somewhere. But yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Hall.
Yeah, I was just saying that we got to put the wall somewhere. We will fit every single one of these recommendations into one of these categories.
Right.
So there will be a practical distinction that we can suss out, and if we think one overlaps too much and we want to have input from two work groups on it, etc., we can manage the process accordingly. And then I think the only other piece was, I don't know if we've mentioned it, but and Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the plan is still to send out a poll to folks and ask which of these work groups you would like to be in and provide your top number 1, 2, and 3. And then we'll get that information and kind of turn around with some work group assignments.
Yes, that's correct.
And Justin, we'll got one more hand up.
Only thing I was going to ask, just kind of going back to just what Damien just said about the committee assignments. I don't know if this is feasible or not, but I had another thing with our national association where we had something similar to this, and rather than it being a poll, they actually sent it like a Google spreadsheet, some type of a living document where we could kind of see as people signed, as you know, we could look at it over the next week and see what people signed up on. Because I think somewhat that respects is it allows us to kind of self-police ourselves, for better word, trying to make sure that we've got some balance on the group. But that's just a thought. It might not work out that way.
Yeah, and I think the process of that would be that, if everyone put their top three in order of priority, then most people will get their top three, one of their top three. If we get a whole bunch of people into financing, then we might have to slot fit other people in, but it might be your second choice that you get moved into. That might be the quickest way. And then if we get a lot, like if nobody signs up for one, then we might have to go in and kind of make some phone calls and see if we can, twist some arms into some work groups.
And can an option be too? You might just to consideration is if to people, I'll say if they're willing to serve on two, just because I think there's a lot of us would be willing to serve on at least two. So
absolutely, I would think so. So to wrap this up, so we're kind of down to this last one, ownership financing. I believe the recommendation from Daniel is to just call it financing. Is that characterized good? I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. Is anybody in opposition to just calling it financing and having it as a super group that we can kind of suss out later? Seeing no one. Any other of these topics that people want to have a conversation about, whether definition, groupings, or otherwise? Mr. Olson, you're on mute.
Sorry, I just want to make sure that the engineering piece of it either goes that it's sort of clearly defined, whether it goes to the first or second group or the third group. I think that's really important because there are a lot of those items that will that apply to that. So I just wanted to make that point. I don't know if I have a preference either way, but it's important that we state that very clearly.
Well, as Mr. Hall said too, like every single one of those subjects are going to get slot filled into one of these, and I think every work group will have an opportunity to kind of look through all of them and see if they have everything they should have, and if there's something they shouldn't have, it should be somewhere else. And so I think there'll be an opportunity to be able to include and add those if it is missing.
Yeah, the only problem is if you want to be in a particular group, you kind of need to know which one it's going to be covered in. At
first blush, I would probably say that codes and design would probably include the engineering portion of that because that's part of that process. Natalie?
I was just going to ask if we would have, if before we signed up or ranked our groups, if we would see what would be under it. That was my question.
I will defer to Matt on the turnaround time from staff on that.
Sounds good. And then do you mind if I just roll into kind of next steps and wrap up?
Yep. Yeah, we're about 10 minutes out. So I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. So if anybody if we're good with this, and I think alternative 2, and with the option of just changing that from ownership financing to just financing, then I think we are good to go. Deborah, I see your hand up. Okay.
Great.
Do I hear anybody in opposition to that proposal? Sounds good. Hearing none, I'll turn it over to Matt to wrap us up for the day.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all very, very much. And I appreciate everybody willing to stay on 10 minutes past for those that could. Just to answer the question, we will be sorting all of the topics into the work groups as best as we can. And, I think we may need you to take the survey ahead of time, but I think we can be flexible with any adjustments if the groupings don't match up with exactly what you were hoping for, because you were looking for a group of topics and it moved into another work group. So we can work with that next week. So don't worry about that. So again, I appreciate it. I just want to say I appreciate all the March meetings. I think in 3 meetings have gone a long way. I was never skeptical, not at all. And so I think it's great. Just again, laying out here the components. So we've gotten everything we need done for the staff to put this into a framework. Like I said, we'll be sorting topics into work groups by the beginning of next week. we'll convene with the co-chairs, the governor and I will talk through assignments and HPAC members based on the survey. So I'll be on the lookout for a survey coming out and try and get back on that as quickly as possible. But other than that, we should have at least the content of what the framework will be for next Friday's meeting. We'll do our best to get it out to you a couple days in advance so you can get a chance to review it, but it will contain these components. So that's what I've got, and I really appreciate everybody's effort and time. All right, thanks all, and have a good weekend.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Patience.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.